my doctor wasn't too sure about it at first. He sort of thought, oh, well, we'll see how it goes. And, okay, I'm losing a little bit of weight. It was at that point, after a few months, because I'd heard about how the relationship between obesity and diabetes, and I was worried maybe I'm diabetic, but I didn't want to get tested straight away. So I waited a few months. It was about 6 months after I'd started low carb, and I went to my doc, okay, can I get tested for these things now? And he was like, sure, and my A1C came back at like 30, 31 with the new measure, which is about 5% by the other. Perfectly normal. And that was great. He was a little bit concerned about my LDL cholesterol, though. That was something that, but he let his eyes convince him. What he could see that I was losing the weight, and he decided that was more valuable than being concerned about a number on a lipid panel.
One thing I've noticed about my GPs is that they're actually a lot more kind of reasonable about things like lipids. If you're in the middle of a process like weight loss or chemotherapy for something, that it is pretty widely known that will affect that will cause temporary changes, and so which is a good it's a pretty good policy to take, that if your patient's doing something that's necessary, don't worry too much about the markers. They could change during that just as a function of it. So,
right.
So that's once you're stable, then they start worrying again, I suppose. But it's I have noticed that, and I thought that's a good attitude to take.
That was kind of what we'd agreed at the time. So let's monitor things sort of afterwards. And so since then, I've gone back to them every year. My numbers all pretty much come back the same. And it was one point, I can't remember if it was last year or the year before, I had the idea that maybe I could actually ask him for a copy of my medical history, to see what numbers that might have been taken while I was still really big, because nobody had really told me what they tested me for whenever I was getting checked out at the docs or at the hospitals. I'd seen various doctors and so on all the time and been tested for various things, but nobody had ever really come back and said to me, "Oh, you've got a problem with this." It was just, "Oh, you're just really fat." But I've actually got them here somewhere. My triglycerides were 1. My HDL was 1.18. My LDL was 2.4. That's not too bad. So overall, they would have been reasonably happy with that. That was a number of years ago. And people might consider that to be kind of average. Well, what they are, as of last year, my trigs are 0.6. My HDL is 2.2. My LDL is 4.1. And on a standard lipid panel, that comes back with a mark beside it. That's higher than all the HH, that sort of thing, high, or whatever it stands for. But it wasn't actually until I found an article, I think it was actually on your blog, profgrant.com, about the trig to HDL ratio.
Yes.
Yeah, we've done a bit on that, haven't we, George?
Yeah, and this is an ongoing story, because the triglyceride to HDL ratio really changes the meaning of the LDL level and tells you whether it's a problem or not.
It in effect it predicts the particle size, doesn't it? There's that inverse relationship.
Yes, it does that, but I think there's more to it than that. It's also indicating your insulin level, which is indicating how likely your body is to kind of use the LDL in bad ways, and it's because when the triglyceride to HDL is low, there's no difference between the last paper I read just yesterday was one where the cutoff was 4.40, so people above or below 4.40 on LDL. Well, if they were in the low triglyceride to HDL group, it made no difference to their risk, whether they were high or low LDL. It made no difference to their risk of heart attack. Now, that was only looking at heart attack, not looking at other conditions, probably other causes of death. Mortality would be reduced in the people with the higher LDL under those circumstances.
Right.
From what we've seen in other.
It's interesting that when we talk about the trig to HDL ratio and what is it that makes triglycerides and HDL so important, and I'd already done a bit of reading to this point about this concept of metabolic syndrome, and now you have these 5 factors, and anybody with 3 or more can be considered to have metabolic syndrome. So to go through the whole 5, there's abdominal obesity, obviously there's blood pressure, blood sugar, triglycerides, and HDL. Those are the 5. And what's interesting is that LDL is not one of those. So many people obsess about, the LDL possibly being a bit out of whack, but when everything else, so many of these other factors, each of which are known to be individually far more important, are looking so much better, is it worth looking to lower that LDL at the cost of everything else? It seems to me that, there's still a bit of catching up to do in some circles.
And there's also the basic mechanism for all of those metabolic syndrome factors, which is carbohydrate controls all of them.
Pretty much.
Yes. Yeah.
As far as I can tell, they seem to affect different aspects of metabolic syndrome in different people to different extents. So for me, as far as I know, I was never diabetic. Or maybe I was, but I've since reversed it anyway. I'll never know, but at this point in my life, what's the difference if I'm eating low carb? It certainly affected me visibly, very visibly. My blood pressure was only ever slightly elevated. I think the highest it was ever measured was like 145/90, but it's totally normal now. My early cholesterol readings were considered sort of okay, and now my trig and HDL are pretty much top of the class almost.